A young man comes to, for a few seconds at most, and the first thing he can feel is the bite of rope on his wrists. His face is swollen shut. His mouth tastes like blood and dirt. He tries to move, but his arms won't come up and his legs won't answer. Above him, there is only open space and the hard line of wood at his back. Then the pain surges again, and the world slips away. Matthew Shepard was 21, a slight, soft-spoken college student who had come to the University of Wyoming in Laramie to study political science and build a life that felt like his own. Friends described him as gentle and witty, the kind of person who listened closely and remembered what you said. In the fall of 1998, Laramie was a small city where people recognized one another, where a stranger in a bar stood out, and where Matthew, an openly gay young man, sometimes had to weigh how visible he could be. On the night of October 6, 1998, Matthew went to the Fireside Lounge at the Buckhorn Bar. Near closing time, two local men, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson, were also there. Witnesses later placed the two men near Matthew in the lounge as closing time approached. What Matthew expected from the conversation is impossible to know. What investigators would later outline, though, is a simple progression. McKinney and Henderson offered him a ride, and Matthew, alone at the end of the night, got into their vehicle. What happened next would later be argued in courtrooms and newspapers, but the core facts do not change. Matthew left the bar with them, and in the early hours that followed, he was beaten, robbed, and abandoned outside town. McKinney and Henderson drove Matthew to a remote area east of Laramie. Along the way, he was attacked. Investigators would later document a brutal assault, pistol blows, fists, and kicks that caused catastrophic head injuries. He was robbed of personal items, including his wallet and credit card. At some point, the men tied him to a split-rail fence, his body slumped against the wooden crosspieces, his hands bound behind him. Then they left him there, alone, as life continued elsewhere, and no one knew where he had gone. Back in Laramie, Matthew's friends realized he was missing. Calls went unanswered. Hours ticked by. For his loved ones, the absence wasn't a mystery with a neat edge. It was a widening dread. His parents were out of state, and when they were reached, they began the same frantic routine families always do, asking questions no one can answer fast enough, hoping the next call will be the one that says he's safe. Nearly 18 hours after he was left at the fence, a bicyclist named Reggie Flutie rode past and saw what she first thought was a scarecrow. When she got closer, she realized it was a human being, motionless, bound to the wood, face and hair matted with blood. She called for help, and emergency responders arrived to find Matthew barely alive. He was unconscious, his skull fractured, his brain severely damaged. They cut him down and rushed him to United Medical Center in Cheyenne, then transferred him to Poudre Valley Hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado, where specialists could try to control the swelling in his brain. At the hospital, doctors worked to reduce swelling and keep his airway protected, but the damage was severe. His injuries included massive trauma to the skull and brain, and he never regained meaningful consciousness. His parents, Judy and Dennis Shepard, flew in and joined friends at his bedside, facing the kind of waiting room time that feels endless. Brief updates, long silences, and the gnawing knowledge that the outcome may already be decided. While Matthew lay in a coma, investigators began moving through the case quickly. Using information from witnesses and tracing the use of Matthew's stolen credit card, police identified McKinney and Henderson. Both men were arrested within days. As the story broke, it spread far beyond Wyoming. The details were stark and easy to hold on to. A young gay man, beaten and tied to a fence, left for dead. For many people, it felt like an exposed nerve, proof of what could happen when hate was given room to breathe. The legal process that followed was not simple or tidy. Prosecutors laid out evidence of robbery and assault, and the state pursued first-degree murder charges. The question of motive, whether the attack was driven by hatred of Matthew's sexual orientation, by the intent to rob him, or by both, became central not only to the case, but to what the country would come to believe it represented. The defense, at different points, tried to recast events in ways that would reduce culpability, but the physical reality of what had happened to Matthew could not be argued away. He had been taken, beaten to the edge of death, restrained, and abandoned. On October 12, 1998, 6 days after the assault, Matthew Shepard died from his injuries. He remained in a coma as doctors fought swelling and secondary injury, but the damage was overwhelming. Family and friends kept vigil, measuring time in updates from the ICU and the quiet hours in between. On October 12th, his injuries proved fatal. When the announcement came, it traveled outward from Wyoming to the rest of the country within minutes. His death turned a Wyoming criminal case into a national reckoning. Vigils were held across the country. In Laramie, people gathered with candles, trying to stand in the place where violence had torn a hole in the community. Others arrived to protest, some carrying signs meant to shame or erase Matthew even in death. Supporters formed lines to block them, holding their own signs, creating a human barrier so that grief could have space. In court, both men ultimately avoided a full murder trial. Russell Henderson pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aaron McKinney entered a plea agreement as well, receiving 2 consecutive life sentences. The deals were shaped by the realities of capital punishment, the families involved, and the desire to end prolonged proceedings. For Matthew's parents, the outcome was not a sense of closure so much as a hard stop to a story that should never have started. What remained after the sentencing was the larger question of what Matthew's death would mean. His name became tied to a movement pushing for stronger protections against bias-motivated violence. For years, advocates and lawmakers argued over whether the country would recognize hate crimes based on sexual orientation and gender identity at the federal level. In 2009, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act was signed into law, expanding federal hate crime statutes and providing resources for investigating and prosecuting such crimes. But laws do not rewind time. They do not untie ropes or erase the hours a young man spent alone against a fence, unseen. In Laramie, people still remember where it happened and what it felt like to realize that the threat was not abstract. It was a car ride away, a few choices made by men who decided another human being could be used, hurt, and discarded. Matthew Shepard's life ended in violence, but the story that followed was built by the living, by a family forced into public grief, by friends who refused to let him be reduced to a headline, and by communities that insisted the truth be faced. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.